There are three numbers that, once you understand how global power truly operates, should make you pause and rethink everything. 12 commercial vessels were seized in a single coordinated move. 40 Russian naval units were deployed simultaneously across three key maritime zones, and an estimated $3 billion worth of global shipping assets now rest under Russia's control. The world's immediate response, especially from Washington, was loud, full of outrage, and layered with threats. But beneath all that noise lies a deeper, more uncomfortable truth, one that few are willing to acknowledge publicly. What happened wasn't a sudden outburst, nor was it an uncalculated escalation. It was strategic, deliberate, and methodically executed. And perhaps the most unsettling detail of all, the strategy didn't originate in Moscow. It was modeled after moves the West has already made. If you want to grasp what just happened, you have to start by looking at Russia's surrounding waters, not as abstract shapes on a political map, but as critical arteries that carry the lifeblood of the global economy. In an operation defined by precision and restraint, Russian naval forces seized liquefied natural gas carriers and oil tankers navigating the Black Sea, the Baltic region, and the Arctic shipping lanes. These weren't obscure ships. They were operated by major Western corporations or sailing under Allied flags. And in every instance, the seizure was backed by legal arguments so complex and deeply technical that teams of Western lawyers are still trying to untangle them. This was no rash decision. It was carefully structured, legally fortified, and anything but improvisational. As expected, Western capitals scrambled. Emergency summits were held, press statements flew out, vague threats of retaliation echoed through diplomatic channels. But for those of us who have spent years watching global foreign policy unfold, something about this episode felt different. The reactions weren't just performative, they were genuinely shocked. The surprise was real, and that's what should worry us most, because it means the world's top strategic analysts missed this even though the signs were right in front of us. This is more than a wake-up call. It's a hard reminder of just how much we've taken for granted. We've grown up believing that international maritime law serves as a protective layer, a global agreement ensuring commercial shipping flows freely and safely. On paper, these rules are vast and detailed, but laws have no teeth unless there's a credible, neutral force willing and able to enforce them. And when that enforcement power is weaponized, the rules themselves don't vanish. They transform into instruments of pressure. To understand how we got here, we need to rewind to late 2022. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the West introduced what it proudly declared as the most severe sanctions regime in modern history. Russian banks were cut off from international financial systems. Foreign assets were frozen in multiple jurisdictions. A cap was imposed on Russian oil prices, a policy meant to keep energy flowing globally while restricting Moscow's profits. From Washington's perspective, it looked like a precision strike, economic warfare designed to weaken without provoking direct conflict. But to Moscow, it looked very different. It looked like the West was unilaterally trying to take control of the global energy trade. The message, while rarely said out loud, was unmistakable. Russia could sell its natural resources, but only on terms defined by its geopolitical opponents. This wasn't enforced through dialogue or diplomacy, but through choke points like maritime insurance, port access, and financial networks. In short, the message was clear. Follow the rules or your cargo doesn't move. For nearly 2 years, Russia endured the squeeze, all while working quietly behind the scenes. Exports were rerouted toward Asian markets. Despite skepticism from Western analysts, Russia expanded its Arctic shipping capabilities. Parallel financial channels were developed to bypass traditional Western-controlled institutions. These weren't quick survival maneuvers. They were long-term preparations, a plan to operate in a world where Western approval was no longer needed. And once Moscow was confident those alternatives were mature, the posture shifted. No longer just absorbing blows, Russia began to push back. That shift became crystal clear toward the end of 2024, when the West escalated things again, this time by physically boarding tankers in international waters. These weren't warships, they were commercial vessels. And the official reason? Suspected violations of the oil price cap. In practical terms, what had started as an economic policy was now being enforced through armed intervention. Commercial cargo had morphed from insurance policies and port paperwork into targets of direct physical action by naval authorities, all in the name of compliance. Moscow didn't respond right away. There were no grand statements, no retaliation, no threats. Instead, Russia observed and documented. Each time a Western Navy boarded a ship, every inspection, every legal justification was quietly recorded. Because Russia didn't just see policy being enforced, it saw precedent being set. A precedent that said, if economic rules justify physical control, then physical control is now a valid tool of statecraft. Russia wasn't preparing to challenge the West's logic, it was preparing to use it. And the opportunity arrived in December. A U.S. operated oil tanker collided with a Russian research vessel in disputed northern waters. The crash killed multiple Russian sailors. The United States called it a tragic accident caused by rough conditions and heavy maritime traffic. But Moscow outright rejected that claim. Russian officials accused the tanker of engaging in espionage and demanded it be brought under Russian jurisdiction for investigation. When the ship refused, Russia labeled its crew fugitives. At this point, the facts of the collision almost stopped mattering. What mattered more was the narrative and how Russia framed it. Rather than treating the incident as a military conflict, they cast it as a criminal investigation. And that single framing shift opened the door for a very different kind of response. Because law enforcement actions are seen globally as entirely different from acts of war, even if the tactics and outcomes look nearly identical. Once that legal foundation was set, Russia initiated its plan with near flawless coordination. Multiple naval units moved in unison across distinct maritime theaters, intercepting and redirecting 12 commercial vessels into Russian-controlled ports. These ships didn't just carry oil and goods, they carried people, hundreds of civilian sailors who suddenly found themselves in legal limbo. They weren't officially labeled as prisoners, but neither were they free to go. Instead, they were reclassified as material witnesses in an active investigation. Overnight, their ability to return home or move freely vanished. None of these men and women had anything to do with the geopolitical maneuvering around them. They had signed up for work, not war, and yet they had become tools of leverage in a strategy far bigger than themselves. What Russia did with these seizures goes far beyond the immediate legal case. It struck at a foundational idea, one that has governed the global economy for decades. The assumption that commercial shipping operates in a neutral space, immune from the fluctuations of great power rivalry, has now been shattered. Russia didn't invent a new tactic. It used a mirror held up to the West's own strategies. And the reflection is hard to deny. If the United States and its allies can board ships in international waters for financial enforcement, then Russia can do the same under a different legal framework. If maritime insurance and banking systems can be turned into enforcement tools, then military patrols can become mechanisms for regulating access. This is not chaos. This is symmetry strategic mirroring at its most effective. That mirroring forces a harsh reality into the open. Can any nation claim exclusive authority to set the rules of the global system without making itself vulnerable to those same methods? Can you enforce regulations across borders and oceans without inviting others to do the same? These are no longer theoretical questions debated by academics. They are playing out right now in real time with real consequences. And those consequences are not limited to the courtroom or the high seas. They're already reaching homes and families, the people left behind by the detained crews, waiting for updates, watching helplessly as their loved ones are swept up in the geopolitical standoff they never asked to be part of. The impact of these events doesn't begin with governments. It starts with individuals. And yet, as this approach gains traction, the ripple effects are growing far wider than any single dispute between Russia and the West. Because once this new model is seen as effective, or even just tolerated, it doesn't stay confined to one actor. It becomes a playbook. Maritime shipping, which accounts for the majority of global trade by volume, now finds itself navigating far more than oceans and weather. It's entering a legal and political storm where the rules are shifting fast. Every modern vessel is equipped with complex electronic systems, communications arrays, and data gathering tools, all of which can, under the right pretext, be labeled as surveillance gear. Environmental codes and regulatory frameworks, written to be broad for flexibility, are now loopholes waiting to be exploited. The line between legitimate oversight and strategic obstruction is fading. And Russia is not the only country taking notes. Other global players with regional maritime ambitions are observing carefully. China, with its growing naval reach and contested territorial claims, is watching. Iran, frequently caught in maritime disputes in the Persian Gulf, is paying attention. Smaller regional powers, too, are assessing what this shift means. They are asking a dangerous but rational question. Is the West truly prepared to protect every commercial vessel that could become a target? The early answer, based on recent events, is not encouraging. Selective enforcement has a cost. It erodes the credibility of international law, because when rules are applied inconsistently, they cease to function as rules and begin to function as signals of who can be tested and how far. What we're witnessing is not the sudden breakdown of the system, but a slow motion erosion. No single moment marks the collapse. There is no explosive declaration. Instead, the structure is weakening through repeated actions that stretch precedent and redefine normal behavior. Every time a seizure is justified, every time a legal framework is manipulated to avoid escalation, the bar for what's acceptable shifts. And once that happens enough times, new norms are established not by agreement, but by exhaustion. We can already see how this plays out in the energy sector. Insurance costs for ships operating anywhere near Russian jurisdiction have spiked. Some routes, once essential to global supply chains, are now considered too risky to justify. And these aren't physical blockades. The waters are open, but the financial exposure, the legal entanglements, the reputational risk, all of it adds up. Routes are being reconfigured, shipments are being delayed, and contracts are being reworded. Supply chains that once prized speed and cost efficiency are now being redesigned around resilience and contingency. That shift brings higher expenses, longer transit times, and greater uncertainty. And it doesn't stop at oil and gas. Nations heavily reliant on imported fuel and materials are feeling the pressure. Businesses that depend on just-in-time delivery are discovering that geopolitics doesn't care about efficiency. Market volatility can be managed, but political risk, that's far harder to predict and harder still to ensure. What began as a narrowly executed operation is expanding outward, touching industries and economies that once felt far removed from naval tensions. And that is exactly what makes this moment so important, because it signals a broader transformation, not just in maritime law, but in how nations engage with each other through commerce, law, and the quiet assertion of power. There is a sharp irony running through this entire situation. The sanctions imposed on Russia were meant to isolate it, to restrict its reach, and to diminish its ability to operate as a global power. Yet those same measures have helped create a different kind of influence, not the influence that comes from integration or dominance, but the influence that comes from disruption. Russia no longer needs to control markets. It only needs to destabilize them. By injecting uncertainty into global trade, it raises the cost of opposition, even for nations with vastly superior economic strength. Instability becomes leverage. Every delayed shipment, every rerouted tanker, every renegotiated contract quietly reinforces the message that the existing system cannot function smoothly under pressure. This form of power does not rely on sustainability. It thrives on friction. And in a tightly interconnected world, friction spreads quickly. This strategy carries unmistakable signs of weakness. Russia understands it cannot win by playing inside a framework designed by its rivals. So it seeks to weaken the framework itself. It is easier to alter the environment than to dominate within it. Once that environment becomes unpredictable, even stronger actors are forced to react rather than dictate. What should disturb us most is not only what Russia is doing, but how unprepared we were for it. We assumed economic pressure could be applied without provoking physical consequences. We believed we could impose pain at a distance while remaining insulated from retaliation. That assumption was not strategic. It was hopeful. And now, as this reality sets in, it becomes clear that what we are witnessing may only be the beginning of a much wider transformation. That transformation compresses policymakers into a narrowing corridor of options. One path is to accept that seizures, inspections, and coercive enforcement are now permanent features of global trade risks to be managed rather than prevented. The other is to confront the truth that without clearly defined limits, Every major power will interpret authority in ways that serve its own interests. Neither choice preserves the stability that commerce has relied on for decades. Both come with costs that are only now emerging. What makes this moment especially dangerous is that it exists in a gray zone between peace and war. No missiles have been launched, no formal declarations have been issued. Yet ships are being taken, crews are being detained, and billions in assets are immobilized in foreign ports. This ambiguity paralyzes response. Retaliation risks escalation. Restraint risks normalization. And with each passing day, the precedent grows stronger. The world quietly adjusts to the idea that commerce itself is fair game in geopolitical conflict. This creates a profound strategic dilemma. Escorting every commercial vessel with military force is neither practical nor sustainable. But allowing seizures to go unanswered signals that maritime law is optional when power imbalances permit it. Deterrence erodes not through defeat, but through hesitation. Adversaries learn precisely how far they can go without provoking a response, and they adapt. For private industry, the consequences are immediate. Shipping companies, insurers, and logistics firms operate on predictability. Their margins are thin, their models depend on stable assumptions. When those assumptions collapse, so does the logic behind global trade. Companies are already reconsidering which flags they sail under, which ports they trust, and which routes they are willing to risk. These decisions are not political statements. They are survival calculations. And once a route is downgraded or abandoned, it rarely returns. The sailors caught in the middle embody this reality. People who sign contracts for routine voyages now find themselves confined in foreign ports, entangled in legal systems they barely understand. Their families wait in uncertainty, knowing their fate is bound to negotiations occurring far beyond their reach. In this environment, individuals become variables in diplomatic equations, valued less for who they are than for what leverage they represent. This is how neutrality fractures. Global trade depends not only on infrastructure, but on shared expectations of behavior. When those expectations dissolve, trust evaporates. Every ship becomes a potential liability. Every voyage carries political weight. Efficiency gives way to caution. Integration gives way to fragmentation. What is unfolding also exposes a deeper contradiction in Western strategy. Sanctions were meant to demonstrate influence without force, control without confrontation, but once physical enforcement becomes necessary to sustain economic pressure, the boundary between financial policy and military action disappears. That line, once crossed, cannot be easily restored. Others will cross it too, using their own interpretations and tools. Russia's message is not subtle. If it cannot operate safely within the existing system, it will make the system unsafe for everyone. That does not require dominance, only disruption. And disruption is far easier to achieve than stability, especially when the rules are already under strain. As this standoff drags on, temporary measures harden into routine behavior. Emergency actions become standard practice. What began as a response to sanctions evolves into a redefinition of how power is exercised at sea. Each day that passes without resolution entrenches the shift. Reversal becomes harder. We are approaching a point where delay is itself a decision. Either new norms are negotiated with clear, enforceable limits that apply equally, or the world drifts into an era where trade moves at the mercy of regional power politics. The ships already held in Russian ports are not just bargaining chips. They are warnings. They show where this path leads. And the next stage of this transformation is already forming. The shift that's coming is not one marked by dramatic confrontations or explosive headlines. It's quieter than that, and in many ways, more dangerous. Governments will continue to release statements, hold emergency meetings, and debate public responses. But the actual decisions, the ones that reshape the future of global trade, are being made behind closed doors by people who rarely appear in the spotlight. Insurers, freight companies, energy traders, and logistics planners are now forced to reckon with a world where yesterday's guarantees no longer apply. Contracts once signed with confidence now come with an unspoken caveat. What happens if this cargo suddenly becomes a geopolitical pawn? That single question is beginning to eat away at the foundation of global commerce because international trade does not thrive on idealism. It thrives on predictability. The moment that predictability disappears, trust begins to crack. As insurers recalculate premiums, as logistics firms redraw shipping routes, a subtle fragmentation begins to take hold. Trade lanes that once connected continents with efficiency are now being redrawn based on politics rather than geography. Companies are seeking safer routes, even if they cost more or take longer. Neutrality, once a shield for commercial shipping, is starting to look like a liability. The flag of ship sails under once a matter of registry and convenience is now being scrutinized for what it signals about protection, risk, and retaliation. The shift is not just in policy, it's in perception. The idea that certain vessels can operate outside the bounds of geopolitical tension is eroding. And as that perception spreads, the structure of global trade begins to change with it. The implications extend far beyond shipping. Every industry connected to trade, from manufacturing to agriculture to tech, is affected. When goods can't move freely, production slows, costs rise, contracts are delayed or broken. Smaller nations, especially those dependent on imports for energy or food, are hit hardest. They face choices they're not equipped to handle. Pay higher premiums for uncertain delivery or face the consequences of shortage and delay. This is the long tail of strategic disruption. Its effects are distributed unevenly and often felt far from the original point of conflict. And that is what gives it power. The ability to destabilize not just one opponent, but entire systems, not through destruction, but through doubt. As new norms take shape, they are not being negotiated openly. They're emerging through repeated action. And each time a new precedent is set, whether through a seizure, a delay, or a rerouting, that action becomes easier to repeat. What would have once sparked a diplomatic crisis is now met with weary acceptance. This is how systems don't collapse, but decay, quietly, incrementally, until what once seemed unthinkable becomes just another day at sea. The true danger isn't in any single act, but in the normalization of behavior that erodes the very principles we assumed were untouchable. The global trading system was built on shared assumptions that rules were consistent, that enforcement was neutral, that borders could be crossed without political interference. When those assumptions fade, the entire system enters a phase of slow fragmentation. What's unfolding now is not an accident of circumstance. It is a deliberate evolution, a shift in how nations exert power and how they interpret the rights and responsibilities that come with global influence. And while Russia's actions have drawn headlines, the deeper shift is more structural, a recognition that enforcement, once seen as a stabilizing force, can also be used as a strategic tool. Not all disruptions require guns or bombs. Some only need paperwork, legal language, and enough uncertainty to make commerce feel unsafe. This is a playbook not just for confrontation, but for reshaping the environment in which confrontation takes place. And Russia is not alone in studying this playbook. Other states, especially those with long-standing maritime disputes or economic grievances, are watching carefully. They are learning not only from what Russia has done, but from how the West responds. When enforcement is selective, it invites interpretation. When response is hesitant, it invites replication. The message sent is not one of strength, but of ambiguity. And ambiguity in global rules creates space for all kinds of opportunism. What we're seeing is the emergence of a new kind of conflict, one where the tools are economic, the actions are legal, and the consequences are strategic. It's a war without declarations, fought not on battlefields, but in shipping lanes and insurance contracts, where the winners aren't those with the most firepower, but those who can generate the most uncertainty. The rules of global commerce are being rewritten, not in treaty halls, but in boardrooms and on shipping manifests. Each new cargo contract is now weighed against a growing list of uncertainties. Will this route be open? Will this vessel be boarded? Will this flag invite trouble? These are not academic concerns, they are daily decisions, each one shaping the next chapter of how trade is conducted across oceans. The world is slowly sliding into a state where commerce doesn't just respond to politics, it becomes indistinguishable from it. And the consequences of that shift are only beginning to take form. Neutrality, once the backbone of maritime law, is now a contested concept. Countries that previously stayed out of great power disputes are realizing they may no longer have that option. Even a small country with a minor port may find itself caught between competing systems of enforcement, unable to guarantee safe passage or uninterested in becoming a pawn in larger geopolitical games. And as these tensions continue to escalate beneath the surface, the vessels already sitting in Russian ports serve as silent reminders of where this path can lead. They are not just assets or bargaining chips. They are evidence of a broader transformation, one that doesn't end with them. The question is no longer just what to do about the current seizures, but how to respond to the logic behind them. Because that logic is being tested, and not only by Russia. Other nations are watching to see whether these actions provoke real consequences or are absorbed into the fabric of a new normal. If the seizures stand, they will not remain isolated incidents. They will be replicated, refined, and potentially institutionalized. This is the threshold we now face, the difference between an exceptional moment and a structural change in how the seas are governed. In that light, the absence of a decisive Western response becomes more than a diplomatic failure. It becomes a signal, and signals matter in international relations. They are often stronger than speeches. They shape behavior. They tell others what is tolerated and what isn't. So far, the signal being sent is not one of strength, it's one of uncertainty. And uncertainty is contagious. It spreads through markets, it spreads through alliances, it shapes how countries prepare, how companies invest, and how people think about risk. We are entering a period in which the power to disrupt may be more influential than the power to control. That shift is subtle but profound, and it has already begun. The questions now facing global policymakers are stark and unavoidable. Can maritime law continue to function if it is no longer universally respected? Can commercial shipping remain viable if every voyage must factor in the possibility of detention or seizure? Can a system based on openness survive in an environment defined by suspicion? There are no easy answers, but the clock is ticking. Delay only hardens the new patterns. Each day that passes without recalibrating the balance between enforcement and restraint allows this fragmented world to take deeper root, and the longer we wait to address it, the harder it will be to restore what has been lost, the predictability, the neutrality, the trust. This is not just a maritime issue. It's a global one. It affects trade, security, diplomacy, and the everyday choices of people and businesses around the world. And as this new chapter unfolds, it's clear that the old assumptions can no longer guide us. A new strategic landscape is forming, one shaped not just by power, but by precedent. And every precedent set today will define what is possible tomorrow.